Hello, welcome to EDU 574. So in today's session, we're going to talk about how do teachers adapt instruction. So adapt in this sense is being used in a very broad term. So not just students with disabilities. At Malloy College, we use the term differentiation of instruction and adaptations differently. However, in some research, they're used synonymously. So we're going to talk about adapting instruction in a broad way, and we're going to become narrow and focused and tease out some of the differences between adaptations and differentiations of instruction. So over the last week, you had an opportunity to go to the CAS website. You had an opportunity to learn about UDL, the principles, the teacher check-in, checkpoint worksheet. So you have all that information. So the beginning of this is a follow-up just to make sure that those ideas are crystallized in your thinking. So for each of the following scenarios, determine which UDL principle and checkpoint the teacher attempts to implement. Are you ready? So here we go. Scenario number 1. Miss Fareed. Miss Fareed is teaching a lesson from the smartboard. She has the keywords highlighted in yellow. As she speaks, she explains the concepts associated with the keywords and deliberately slows her rate of speech for emphasis of what is most important. The font she uses on the board varies in size and color, and when the students break out into groups, their handouts are visually different. So which of the UDL concepts is Ms. Fareed implementing? Pause the video if you need to. So let's look at checkpoint 1.1. That is what Mrs. Fareed is trying to accomplish. So if you go back to your notes, please remember that when we look at UDL, the UDL advocates that there should be all three of these principles happening at the same time for it to truly be a UDL lesson or a UDL curriculum. There should be in a lesson multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. So I'm teasing this out just to test you to see which one you have identified, because we're scaffolding this to make sure that you understand these principles. So you ready for another one? Let's try another one. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres math class. In Mr. Torres math class, the students are working on numbers and operations in base 10. The students are using base 10 blocks. They are also required to write an answer to the math problem in a complete sentence or complete sentences. The students have access to calculators, sentence starters, and can look back at the YouTube video used in the beginning of the lesson. The students are encouraged to draft their ideas in sentences or pictures before writing down their final answer to this question. If Sam has 3 10s and 2 1s, and Billy has 6 10s and 5 1s, who has more? How much more does he have? If Billy gives Sam all of his 10s, how much would Billy have? Explain your answer and show your thinking. So when you look at the beginning of that, how the questions are set up, which principle of UDL is being highlighted in this example? Checkpoint 5.2. So please take a look at that so that you will know what that is. Did you get it right? Okay. Again, UDL principles, multiple means of representation, action and expression, and engagement. One more. Mrs. Dyson. Miss Dyson is monitoring a writing assignment. The students are using the PEN strategy, which stands for pick a formula, explore the words, note the words, search and check. Miss Dyson has directed the students to stop after each step and confer with a writing partner. She has an example posted, and students have sentences they wrote yesterday in their notebooks open on the desk. She has a thinking chair, 30 seconds, for writer's block. She invites the students to use these items when they are feeling stuck. So this one is a little bit more difficult, I think. It's trying to really pull out a particular checkpoint. So can you figure out which checkpoint this might be? Take a look at your paper, the teacher's checkpoint paper from UDL that was posted for that online session. Pause if you need to. So that was checkpoint 9.2. So from UDL to differentiation to adaptations, what is the essential difference between the three? What is the difference between UDL, differentiation of instruction, and adapting for students with disabilities? Think about that for a second. What do you think the differences are? Well, in looking at the literature, these are some of the insights that I have to share during this session. So looking at Tomlinson in 2001, who wrote a lot about differentiation of instruction. And differentiation of instruction really is about doing things in the class for everyone in the class, making sure you meet the needs of all students. And so she introduced some concepts that we know of and that we've talked about. We're looking at the content, the process, and the product of the lesson and making sure that students have an opportunity to participate because we are differentiating those things based on different student needs and levels. Also, the learning environment as a whole is something that there was a lot of focus on that in her theory about what a classroom should actually look like and what should be happening in a classroom environment. So in this model, there are 5 dimensions of differentiation, and it's the content, the classroom, the products, the instructional strategies, but most importantly, you, the teacher. How you manage it, how you organize it, how you implement it. So there's all these 5 things operating at the same time, and all are tools to differentiation. So in looking further into the research, from writers from Tomlinson to Ernest, Heckman, Thomas, Hull, and Carter, Welsby, these are the things that I found, a list of what a differentiated classroom looks like. So according to these researchers, this is what should be going on in a differentiated classroom. There should be varied reading material. So leveled libraries, leveled books, different types of books, different types of reading material, reorganized content. So There might be content that is presented in a different way, varied support provided to students, the use of graphic organizers and concept maps, tiered activities, centers, use task-specific sheets for individuals and whole class. So you might create a task-specific sheet for someone who might have a particular issue, so that your handouts may not be always identical. Manipulatives, customized visual displays, different products. Students are allowed to do different products that will be used to be assessed. Different expectations that allow for varying degrees of difficulty. I'm going to go back to that in a second. Used rubrics that were developed based on the varying ability of a student, design lessons based on learning style, flexible grouping, and a continual assessment. So going back to the different expectations in special education theory of quite some time ago, this is really going back historically, there was something called the planning pyramid that was developed by, I can't think of the name of the researcher right this second, but the planning pyramid was basically where the idea of tiering came from. So at the bottom of that pyramid, it was what all students would know as a result of this lesson. So there was an expectation that every student is going to learn all of the same thing. Then as you move up, there are some students who are going to take that information and extend it just a little further. And then at the very tip, there are what a few may walk away with. So there was this concept of a variability in expectation and objectives. That practice is not completely adhered to now, especially in New York State, when we look at assessments. So assessments really does drive some of our ideas. So this idea of a planning pyramid really was used at how to teach kids in the classroom. Some places still use those types of ideas, but some places do not, because of this drive of students need to be at the same place at the very end. So that, and so also here at Malloy, there's only one goal there's only one objective for a lesson. There are not multi objectives, because there has been a lot of debate about that particular idea. So that the idea is that all students have access to the same thing and almost the same outcome, but how they get there, it will be different. And that's where the differentiation comes in. So that is a definitely a topic for discussion. But what I'm proposing here, what I'm presenting to you, is what I found as I looked through the research of what is a differentiated classroom, what does it really mean, and this is what most of the research is showing, that these things that are listed is what differentiation really is and what you should see in a differentiated classroom. And so when we differentiate, the idea is that, and you've learned this with CAST, is that we start off by trying to meet the needs of a variety of learners. And as we meet the needs of a variety of learners, and we from the start change or add these opportunities and do these things to our lesson, the more we do this up front, the less we have to add additional adaptations for individual students, is basically what the concept is. So how is this differentiation different from adapting instruction for students with disabilities? So I have some thoughts about how it's different, but let's first go to the research and see how adapting instruction for students with disabilities is defined. So we just saw how it was defined in the research for differentiation. So let's see what the research says about making adaptations for students with disabilities. So Jenny and Snell, from the 1980s to the present, who are really two well-known, respected researchers who have been doing special education for a very long time, did a book and series of books that have been revised called Modifying Schoolwork in Inclusive Classrooms. And they define making adaptations as teachers adapt instruction so that students with disabilities can learn in the context of the general education classroom with typical classmates. So that's sort of a very general definition, but it is the very first, I think, operational definition that we have. And so that has continued to evolve. And in their work, they talked about having supplementary goals, so that there will be supplementary goals could focus on remediation of basic skills or deficits, or developing compensatory skills. So the two ways that we have historically looked at working with students with disabilities is, one, to remediate skills, or two, teach them how to compensate for the skills that they do not have. Also, another thing that was introduced with adaptations was simplifying goals. And so that there was a creation of goals that were from a lower grade level, or reduced in the number, or required less complex types of learning for those students, which again, this is more historic. In inclusive classrooms now, that may not necessarily be the case, but in actuality, because of the assessments, and that has really changed a lot of this conversation. But in best practices, even outside of New York State, this still occurs, where you will have leveled books. So you might have reading material at a lower level, but the content is the same because the reading level of a student might be lower. Or you might have a student who is not able to take in all the complexities of what you're trying to teach, but can get the meat of it. And so there might be less complex. So simplified goals was a concept that was in the literature. Also, alternate curricula goals. So we do have students in New York State who are in an alternate curriculum, few, because of the way we're structured. So those students are life skills students, and they participate in a different curriculum, but the curriculum still does parallel, or have some pieces of it that mirror what others are learning, in a sense, because there's an issue of equity that is sort of like an underpinning element that kind of has reshaped some of these ideas. So alternate curriculum goals, so significantly simplified academics and alternate learning goals that emphasize the skill needed for daily life skills at school, at home, and in the community. So how to adapt instruction or to modify it, there's some suggestions from these researchers and others. And they say that what you need to do is gather and share information about the student and the classroom. And then think about, what do we know about the student? What do we know about the classroom? And then think about which adaptations are needed. And then as you start to layer in those things, look for glitches in participation, where the students falling through the cracks when we change whatever we're changing. So you're going to see in a strategy that I created, that concept of glitches, I call it tweaking. We'll revisit that, because really that's the essence of making adaptations, is you're looking for those glitches and you're trying to fix or actually prevent some of those glitches from happening, continually happening. So we see where the student is at, we see what they're struggling in, and we see where that glitch occurs. So we try to adapt what we're doing for that student because of that specific glitch that is happening. So another suggestion too, It's from the National Center on Disability. And some of the things that they say an adaptation is when we change the presentation or we modify the presentation, we modify the way the students can respond, we modify the timing, we can modify setting, and some of these are more accommodations. So an instructional adaptation is different from accommodation in that there is an idea of instruction, what you're doing in the lesson, and accommodation is more environmental. But when you look at something like presentation and response, that is part of what's happening in the lesson, because students, you are presenting and students are responding. So when people say adaptations and accommodations, is because there is overlap in some of that. So when we talk about testing, even in giving a test, which is not instructional time, it's test time, there are other things that we can do so that students can be fairly assessed. And basically, National Center on Disability gives all of these recommendations, which you will see again because we will talk about that in the ADAPT strategy. But they say that any reasonable accommodation that a student needs should be afforded them when they're testing. New York State might say differently. That has changed a little bit, but there are parameters as to what is reasonable. So again, we're on a historic journey here with what we have learned and what the research is telling us. So is an accommodation or modification an, that shouldn't be an adaptation. So what's the difference? So let's tease out some of this language. So accommodation allows access without changing the curriculum. Okay? A modification is a changes in curriculum. So from the special ed guide, this is what it says. In many cases, this has lowered expectations. For example, modified text. So we have accommodations, modifications, adaptations in instruction, which is what's happening in the lesson. But again, accommodations allows access without changing the curriculum. There's pieces of that overlap, I think, with adaptations or adaptions. Really, that word is adaptions. And in many research articles, differentiation and adaptations are used interchangeably, as well as adaptions. So it's really looking at what's happening inside the learning unit, the learning that we want students to have, and we're not changing the curriculum. Students are in the same curriculum, but we're looking at using the same curriculum and meeting the needs of diverse students. So this is not about modifying and necessarily lowering expectations, which I think is a big deal with differentiation. We're supposedly not doing that. So we're differentiating, and for students with disabilities, we're making an adaptation so that they can be in the same curriculum in the same lesson. So a third suggestion about how to adapt instruction. This is from Positive Environment Network trainers, and they say, change is permissible in educational environments which allow the student equal opportunity to obtain access, results, benefits, and levels of achievement. So this is how they say you should adapt instruction. So development and use of curricular adaptations for students receiving special education. This was an article written by Kurth and Keegan. And in this particular article, it was reported that educators reported not applicable or I don't know when they were asked about students' IEP goals. So which IEP goals adaptations was linked to. and 88% of adaptation samples provided. So they did this study, and there was a group of teachers, and they made adaptations. So they asked the teachers, how was this linked to the IEP goals of the student? And they didn't know. They couldn't answer that. And so what they found in their study, and looked at novice teachers and experienced teachers. So it was a good study. They had a lot of teachers that they surveyed. And what they found, this is one of the things, that experienced educators were more likely to use adaptations that changed the difficulty level or response format, whereas novice educators were more likely to use adaptations that were fundamentally different from the original lesson. So an experienced teacher will make a change that will change the difficulty level, usually making it a little bit more simplified or change the format. And the novice teachers, they were like from left field. They were doing something totally fundamentally different. So this is really interesting and important, because we're going to talk about, well, how do you make adaptations as a novice teacher? What do you do? And so the research in this article I pulled out because the novice teachers really didn't know what to do. So when we look at teachers who are more experienced, most frequent adaptations used by experienced teachers is reducing the length of assignments, using manipulatives and other tools, adding visuals, and providing extra time. So novice teachers that they observed and surveyed, novice teachers were less likely to use reduced length, quantity of assignments, or permit visual tools. So that was really interesting that the novice teachers didn't do anything closely resembling the experienced teachers. So 89% of adaptations were made in core general education classes, their main subjects, opposed to other periods such as art, music, and recess. So that probably makes a lot of sense. So also in this study, instructional adaptations, they found 53% of instructional adaptations were impactful, curricular adaptations 31%, and then just alternative types of adaptations were made by teachers that were just totally something different. So educators with more years of experience are more effective than novice educators. The more experienced teachers created higher quality adaptations. Specifically, novice educators created adaptations that were cumbersome and did not fit the lesson. Very interesting when I read this. Quality and clarity of adaptations or adaptions. Novice educators provided adaptions that were lower quality ratings than experienced educators. General education teachers provided adaptions that were lower quality and clarity ratings than special education teachers and paraeducators. That makes sense. So we're going to talk about why that is. Comparisons of experienced teachers to novice teachers suggest the importance of on-the-job experience in creating quality adaptations supports for students' inclusive settings. So of course, the novice teachers were not creating the same quality because there's something about on-the-job experience. That is really important. I'm going to come back to that point. Experienced teachers were focused on accessing core general education curriculum. So they wanted to make sure the students really got that information. Intended to create adaptions directed to what the class as a whole with only minor or no changes for individuals, whereas special education teachers developed exclusively individual adaptations. So when they looked at it, the novice teachers, weren't so good. The general education teachers who experienced were, okay, but the special education teachers, just that's their forte, and they just did these more individualized adaptations that were really impactful. So in a unit-based approach to adaptation in an exclusive classroom, Kurth and Keegan, actually Kurth alone at this point, is still looking at this whole phenomena of how do we make these adaptations and what have we learned. So we see that even with all the information that's out there, we still have novice teachers that really don't know what they're doing. We have general ed teachers who are trying a little bit, but really not focused on students with disabilities, and special education teachers who are doing it and doing it rather well. But at this point, we don't have two teachers in the classroom, and special ed is sort of off by itself. So they were looking at, okay, so how do we use adaptations, let's say for a unit? So what do we do? And so this is the fourth suggestion on how to adapt instruction, again from the literature. And so they say determine student learning needs and supports, evaluate classroom routines, define student learning outcomes, gather materials and create specific adaptations, implement those adaptations, and evaluate those adaptations. So from this information and these suggestions, we know that, one, the research shows us that we need to have a better understanding of the difference between differentiation of instruction and adaptations. Novice teachers have to graduate and leave school knowing how to do this because the expectations have changed over time. And so for future directions, novice teachers need to understand how quality adaptations can be created, what factors are associated with correct implementation, how do we grade and assess that, and how adaptations facilitate participation, progress, and access. So how to adapt instruction? Maybe it's the way we think about it and approach it. So this is suggestion 5. So in examining teacher thinking, constructing a process to design curricular adaptations by Ulvari Soner, she says, teachers appear to conduct an internal personal dialogue in a sense. A sequence of self-questioning occurred that guided reflection of their own practice. So this is really interesting because in all of the other methods or other suggestions, the 4 prior to this, the real self-reflection and questioning piece, I think, was absent. So there's this idea of, okay, this is what you should do, but then, what about how to think about it? Again, part of what we will talk about with the ADAPT strategy of how important it is to have those self-questioning practices where you start to reflect on your practice and what you are doing. So suggestion number 6 by Shum, 1999, is flexible. And so Shum said, okay, so in flexible, the question is the adaptation feasible, lively, eliminated, explicit, intentional, beneficial, limelight, evaluated? So from here, we're going to pause because this is an introduction to what we will be talking about in the coming session. So we're going to look at how differentiation and how adaptations is a little different. UDL thrown in the mix, basically, they're all trying to get at the same thing. And that is, when we look at instruction, and all three of these are really saying students are in the same curriculum. It is what I'm getting from it, is that they're in the same curriculum. So if you have students in the same curriculum, and we know that there is no average student, there is no one really learns the average way. So that's a concept that's not really real. How do we keep students in the same basic curriculum, or the same, we're teaching like the same goal? How do we meet all of these needs? We have students who might need very individualized needs, and then we have students that are just a variety of learners. So going back to a couple of slides, we have Tomlinson, we have all the other researchers who made suggestions about differentiation. This is what it looks like, and we're trying to meet the needs of everybody. And then we have UDL, which also says if you put in variety and you have these multiple means, there is enough presented so that many students will find access into the curriculum. And then we have others who specifically look at those tailored adaptations that are needed sometimes for students with disabilities, and we see that there's a little confusion about how to do that and how to do that well. And so I propose that perhaps it's the reflective practice that we need to think about as a teacher, and not so much what a adaptation should look like, but how we should be thinking about actually doing that. So that will be what we will discuss the next time, and this is an introduction to that. So thank you, and if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know, and we will talk about the adapt strategy, which lends itself as a continuation based on the concepts that's in this PowerPoint. Thank you.